But yeah. Yes.
For the video page, I just put like screenshot in the video.
Yeah.
Are we gonna actually be like linking to the video?
So the way that, assuming that the video is hosted somewhere like YouTube or Vimeo, there's a very easy way to embed that video onto your page. So we're talking about that. If your video is not on YouTube or Vimeo, and you have access to the video, then I can show you privately how to actually kind of put that on YouTube or Vimeo.
Yeah, because I haven't
Yeah, for the design, that's perfectly fine.
My video comes from actually from the homepage.
The video comes from the... Oh, okay. We might just need to take a look into how best to get that. But like I said, I'm perfectly fine with you just using something that's if whatever company or icon that you have, if they have like their own YouTube channel, you can just use something off of that for the content.
Is it easier to use on YouTube?
Yeah, much easier. And like I said, if you have a video, like if you have the video, which is not already on YouTube or Vimeo, I can show you how to actually put that. Yeah. Okay. So, if we take a look at where we were a couple of weeks ago, what we had was, we had a really basic HTML page here, and we're just going to keep kind of building off of this. We have a really basic HTML page here. We have these H1 tags here, which I discussed as far as like the H, 1 through I think it's 6 is pretty typical. Different kind of heading tags like that. We talked a lot about as far as like how to do the paths to different HTML files, as well as the paths to different images files, how it works. Very similar in the same way with both the anchor tags as well as the image tags. And the last thing that we were talking about was using IDs and classes in conjunction with our CSS. So we have these IDs and classes as a way of identifying a very specific element or set of elements within our CSS. So within our HTML, we have a paragraph tag with the ID first paragraph. In our CSS, when we want to identify that specific paragraph, we use hash, the hash number sign, and then we use that ID name. We can also say the tag itself, hash, and that ID name. Both of these will do the exact same thing in this context. It's just a simple matter of personal preference whether or not you put the tag name before the actual hash number sign. When it comes to the classes, for example, with this strong tag, we have a class that says blue text. In our CSS, in order to identify that, we use the dot or period. So we have simply dot blue text, or we can have strong dot blue text as a way of identifying that specific strong tag with that class. So again, this is mostly a matter of personal preference. Both these will do the exact same thing. I often like to have the tag before the dot or before the hash sign, just because, again, coding is very much a conversation with your future self. So I want to make sure that it's as clear as possible to me what it is that I'm actually doing when I'm looking at the CSS file. If I just see it like this, I might say, first paragraph, I have no idea what that is. It says paragraph in it, so I think that's obvious enough. But say something like more like blue text. Blue text, I don't really know what that is. Oh, that's right, I'm doing blue text on the strong tag. So this is something that already has a font weight to it. So by having the tag there, again, it's just a little more clear. So I know we very briefly went over as far as the ID and the classes, but we always have the option of not including an ID or a class. Like this paragraph here, we don't necessarily have to have an ID or class to every single element in our page. We only need to put an ID or class in if we want to specify something a little bit different about that element. For example, in this one, we want to change the color. Or if we want to change something about the font family or any other font properties as far as the style of it, as far as the weight of it, we only need to add in a class or an ID for something which is going to be a little bit different. So, for example, all of our paragraphs are going to have these properties to them. All of our paragraphs are going to have a font size of 20 pixels, and all of our paragraphs are going to have a line height of 30 pixels. That's the standard, the default throughout our entire page. We only put in an ID for first paragraph because just for that one paragraph, we want to make sure that the text is green. So we add that ID to that one paragraph. Now the difference between, yes.
In my homework, I made every paragraph in different colors, and then I called each paragraph a different name. And then I gave each paragraph like a different class.
Yeah, so
But so that would be like the time to do that. Like if you want each paragraph a different color.
yeah, that would be a really good use of using different IDs in there. So that actually brings me, to the next part. When do we use class and when do we use IDs as far as the difference between the two? IDs are only used, or I should say, the ID that you have should only be used once in an HTML file. Whereas a class, the idea is that you're using it multiple times in the same exact file. So here we have the strong with the class blue text. We also have a strong with the class blue text here. In our HTML, we have two strong tags here that we want to have be blue. So in this case, we're using a class so that we can use that same class multiple times. If there's something that's unique that we're only doing once, then this is where we use an ID. And again, we can only use that once in this same HTML file. If we decide like, oh, actually I want both of these paragraphs to be green, but no other paragraphs, I don't just simply want to use this ID twice here.
Can you name the second paragraph?
Yeah, you could absolutely name this second paragraph, but if we do that, then we have to actually set up a second paragraph here. What I would recommend is if you want to use the exact same property, for example, changing the color to be green, then instead of first paragraph and second paragraph, I would just use a class. And you might want to change the class to something more general, but you don't necessarily have to. So it might just be green paragraph. And that way, when it's a class, you're free to use it multiple times.
So then with since the strong tag is always blue, should that be enough to email class?
So right now I'm using the class blue text and I'm using it twice. Naturally any text is going to be black, but you can see in the CSS that all of the strong tags are this red color. So all the strong tags are supposed to be this red color, but here with the CSS I'm saying that anything with the class blue text should be blue.
Oh, so it could be strong or
It could be
it could be bold or it could be not bold, but either way it will be blue.
well strong. By using the strong tag, that means it's absolutely going to be bold. So no matter what, it's going to be bold whenever I use the strong tag, whether I use the class on it or not. So here I'm using the class blue text, and here I'm not using the class blue text. So both of these are going to be bold just because I'm using the strong tag. Now in the CSS, here I'm saying all strong tags should be red. So by default, this one is going to be red. and this one down here is going to be red. But I'm also getting even more specific by saying any strong tag that has the class blue text should be blue. So this one is going to remain red because it doesn't have any class on it, and this one's going to turn blue because I do have that class on it. Does that make sense?
Can class be regular instead of strong?
Sorry?
A class can be regular instead of being strong.
So we can put this class, this part that I have highlighted here, this is the attribute.
Can
So
it be just regular instead of being strong? Can you call it a class regular? No.
you're saying use
Instead
the...
of using the word strong, can you do, I don't know, regular? That is no
Oh.
font.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so you can put a class or an ID on just about everything. Now, paragraphs and strongs and anchor tags, all of these have some properties set up to them already. So like the H1 tag, for example, is already going to be a little bit bigger. It's also going to have a font weight to it. The anchor tags are naturally going to be blue and underlined, so that has some properties already set to it. Strong is automatically going to be bold. So a lot of HTML tags already have some properties set up in the background. So I think what you're asking is there a way to do a class or an ID on something that doesn't already have some sort of extra properties in it? So the ideal, give me one second, I'm just going to change these back to IDs. Okay, so there are two ideal tags that we have that are just regular, just blank slates to work off of. The first one is div. So just like with any of our tags, we have a beginning div, we have an ending div. And div you can kind of think of like a paragraph in the sense that whatever text we put in there is going to have like a line break before and after. So a div is just, it's short for division, but basically it's just a very regular block level element. Block level meaning, again, it's going to have a return before and after. So this is where we would typically have another kind of paragraph. And again, it works kind of the same way as a paragraph tag itself.
Automatic as soon as you type div and you put your copy between two, it defaults to whatever div is.
Yeah. So the thing is, it's not going to have any sort of, it's not going to have a font weight like a bold does. It's not going to have a font style like the EM or italics tag has. It's not even going to have a size to it like the H1 tag has. It's basically going to be whatever the default of the browser is. Now, in theory, people can set up defaults on their own browser. So on your version of Firefox or Chrome at home, you can say what the default text is as far as like the font family, even the color, things like that. But typically, you're absolutely right. Most browsers are set to Times New Roman black text. Yes. So whenever I use div and I don't have a class or an ID on it, then it's just going to have the default settings on it. Now,
is there a difference between div and paragraph? Are they interchangeable, or?
That's a good question. Paragraphs tend to actually have a little bit of margin or spacing around them, and it's actually kind of up to the browser's discretion what that will be. So I'll show you in a, okay. So we have these two divs right after each other, and we have these two paragraphs right after each other. So we take a look at this in the browser, and this is Firefox. You'll see that, well, I forgot, I set the font size for the paragraphs. Let's take that out for a second, just so it's a little more normal. Okay, so you see that these two divs that I have here are coming right after each other. So it looks almost just like I have a normal line break in between this div here and this div here. Whereas the paragraphs have a little bit of spacing around them. So typically a paragraph is good if you actually want to have paragraphs within your text. So a paragraph would be good for like the history page or the about page, where you're going to have a couple of paragraphs just in the content section. However, divs can sometimes be more useful when it comes to just general positioning of things. For example, you might want to put your navigation in a div. That way you don't have to worry about any extra padding or margin that you don't want. You might want a div for the logo, for example. So that way you can kind of position it in one specific spot, and again, don't have to worry about extra margin or padding that you don't actually mean to have in there. But again, paragraph tag is perfectly fine when it actually comes to real paragraphs within your content. So we talked about the div as tag that is just regular. It's a blank that has no extra properties set to it. Div is again a block level element, which means it naturally has a line break before and after. But we also have inline elements, like the anchor tag is an inline element. The strong tag and the EM tag, the bold tag and the italics tag, these are all inline elements, which means that within the line of a normal paragraph, it's just going to kind of naturally be in there. So for example, the strong tag here is inline and does not have a line break before and after it. It's inline with everything else. So there is an inline element that is regular, just like div is the block level element that's regular. The inline element is called span. So span is an element which has, again, no property set to it. It's just going to be the default. And there's really never any reason why you would use span unless you're actually putting a class or an ID on it, because it just does absolutely nothing. But if we have span and we have something like a class that is red text or something like that, then we can use that class red text over and over again. We can use this class red text over and over again with different spans, so we always know that everything that has that class is going to be red. But because we're using a span, we don't have to worry about it having also a font weight or a font style or something like that. So if we have span red, let's say that we have span blue text, for example. So we have span blue text, and we can use that over and over again throughout our content. But the difference between span blue text with the class blue text and strong with the class blue text is we can set both of them up in our CSS so that they will both have the color blue. But span blue text will only make the text blue, whereas strong blue text will make it blue but also bold because it's using the strong tag.
I have a question about this. Because I'm just thinking like how my website's designed, like with the different like blocks of color.
Yes.
Would like each chalk be a div?
It would probably be the best way to set it up, yeah. I would mostly, when in doubt, I would use div over paragraph. Because again, div is a little bit more reliable, we'll say it that way. Because it doesn't have any extra padding or margins around it. So when in doubt, I would use a div as a way of separating out this block from another block of content. And you can put an ID or class on it in order to actually set the positioning or the size of it.
I'm like going through an HTML on a website that I'm working on that I didn't really know before, and I see a lot of span elements. Does that mean, and I don't know where they're coming from, does that mean one of the classes has to be used in CSS to figure out what it's supposed to be?
Yes, exactly. So, again, typically you're going to see a class or an ID on a span. The only time you wouldn't see a class or a span on it is if, just like with this paragraph tag, we don't have a class or an ID on this. Just like with the strong tag, we don't have a class or an ID on it. You could do span and put whatever sort of property you want on this. So this would make all the spans like font family Arial. And that would work even without an ID or class on them. It's just rare, like, because again, you know, there's better ways of kind of programming it so that it's more clear as far as what that span is actually doing. So yeah, spans are very common, but usually you almost always have them with a class or an ID attached to them as well. Any other questions? Okay. So I keep talking about as far as like these inline elements and these block level elements. This point would be a really good time to bring up what's called the box model. So on the class website, there's a link to an article about the box model. This is a pretty good read. I would actually recommend kind of reading through this at some point to kind of understand a little bit better. But the box model, and you can find different illustrations of this online. This is a pretty good one though. The box model is essentially how the browser is interpreting any block level elements. Again, block level elements are the ones that are naturally going to have a line break before and after. It's the different elements that you use to create a section on your site. And again, you can actually have blocks within blocks. You can have divs within divs. You can have paragraphs within divs. However, it makes the most sense to actually position your content. But for the most part, whenever it comes to any sort of blocks or rectangles on your design, this is how the browser is actually looking at it. We have the content. The content itself would be the text and the images. And around the content, we have a padding. Around the padding, we have a border. And around the border, we have a margin. So a lot of times, it's tough to really get a sense of what the box really looks like without a border and without any sort of background to it. So just the text by itself, it's hard to really kind of see it this way. But if we add in a border, if we add in a background, then it's gonna the box model itself is going to be a little bit more clear. So let's go ahead and okay, I'm going to go ahead and create a new HTML file here. And we're just going to simplify this a little bit. So, let's go ahead. Yeah, sure, we'll keep that in there. But I'm just going to start off with a few divs of content here. A few divs of this lorem ipsum here. So I have 4 paragraphs here, and each one is within a div. So as far as my HTML is concerned, all we have are 4 divs here of various lengths as far as the different paragraphs. We still are tied into the style sheet here, but for now, let's go ahead and clear out most of what this style sheet is doing, just so we're starting pretty fresh. Okay, so as it is right now, if we take a look at this page, we just have 4 paragraphs here. I'm going to make this just a little bit larger. We have 4 paragraphs here. It's tough to even see where the paragraphs really end, but we have 4 paragraphs here which are just coming right after each other. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by putting a border on one of our divs. Let's go ahead and say, let's give each of these divs an ID. So we'll say first div, second div, ID third div, and ID fourth div. Now, I might not use all of these immediately, but just when it comes to HTML, and we always start with our HTML when we're building these kinds of things out. We start with the HTML and we start with simply dividing up the content. We divide up the content in the different divs and spans that we want, and then we actually start to assign things as far as the IDs, the classes, and things like that that we actually plan to actually use in our CSS. And again, it's fine if we don't use it, but sometimes it's great to put something on there, just if we're planning on doing something in the future. So, as it is right now, I have a different ID on each one of these divs. And just by putting an ID on that, it doesn't do anything to the page whatsoever. Doesn't do anything to the content. So in our style, I'm going to spell out div with the ID second div. And again, this will work without the tag name, but again, I like to have the tag name in there so that it's as clear as possible. I have the tag name itself, and then the hash number sign, and then the ID name here. So again, the template for this is tag name, hash ID name, or tag name dot class name is how we define something in our HTML that has an ID, or something in our HTML that has that class. Okay, so we have div hash second div. So first, let's go ahead and start off by putting a border on this. So the border property works like this. We start off with just simply the property name border, and then colon, and then this is where we would have in the value. Now, with a lot of properties that we have, the value is very simple. We have font size, and then we have that size itself. We have the size itself, like 20 pixels. Or we might have color, and the value, which is on the other side of the colon, is just what that color is. And again, we can use a word like red, but it's much better to actually use the hash and then whatever the X value is for that particular color. So this is green, for example. So a lot of times we simply have the property name, colon, and then the value. And the value is typically very simple. It's just one different thing. Border is a little bit different. Border, we actually have 3 different values in one. We define the border in 3 different ways. We define the width of the border, the style of the border, and the color of the border. So with border, we can say, for example, 2 pixels, solid, and then you can just trust me if that's green. Or again, you can use the words if it's something very, very simple. I just highly recommend using the hash symbols, which you can pull from Photoshop whenever you want to. So, with border, again, we have 3 different values. The values are separated out by spaces. And again, the first value here is the width. The second value is the style. and the third value is the color. So, we can also, for example, have 5 pixels dashed, and then this will be a red. But we have the width, we have the style, and we have the color. The style, we have a few different options as far as that style. I almost always use either solid or sometimes dash, so I forget what the other options are. But we also have, as far as dotted, dashed, double, groove, ridge. There's a bunch of different potential examples of what you can do with the border style itself. But the most common thing would just be a solid border. Sometimes you're using a dash border as far as like those different dashes around it. But obviously solid is the more common one. So if we put in a 2-pixel solid border that's a green around our second div, then when we refresh the page, we're going to see a border around our second div here. So again, this is a green border, it's just a solid. As we increase the width of it, obviously it's doing the width of the stroke around that border. This line right here is 10 pixels high, this is 10 pixels wide, so it's doing that width as far as the border there.
Can you go to the top of your HTML? I was just trying to follow. Well, I forget how to link.
Oh, yeah, as far as the CSS, yeah. I just pulled this from the last one that we did. But again, this is going to be inside the head section of the HTML. We have the link tag. And the link tag has 2 different attributes in here. The attributes themselves you can kind of see are in red here. The first attribute, we simply say rel equals style sheet. And that's pretty much exactly as it is. There's no changes to that. The href for that might be slightly different, depending on what it is you're trying to do. Because the href is defining the path to the CSS file as well as the name of it. Now, style.css is a very, very common name, and it's pretty typical to have your CSS file in the same directory as your HTML files. So this would probably be pretty typical for a lot of website setups. But like I said, the rel style sheet is exactly as it is, whereas the href style CSS might be a little bit different. But yeah, so we have a green border around our second div here, and again we can change up that style to like dashed or dotted. There's, like I said, there's a few different options there, but probably solid is the main one you want to go with. Now, okay. Now, it is possible to actually separate this out in order to make it more clear. You can actually say border dash width 5 pixels. Border dash style, solid, and border dash color is green. These 3 lines do the exact same thing as this one line. There's no difference as far as the browser is concerned, as far as doing it this way or as doing it this way. It's mostly a matter of personal preference. So that whatever is more clear to you as the programmer, as far as what kind of style you actually want to do. The only other thing about it would just be, say that we have on all of our divs. So I'm just going to use div here. And say that I say border 5 pixels solid green on all of our divs. And then for any one of these individual divs that have an ID, I could say, well, just for second div, I want to make the width 10 pixels. Or just for the first div, maybe I want to set the border color to be something different. So that would be a good example of when to actually use the border dash property rather than just the border itself. This is setting up a border for all of our divs, and this is changing just one of those properties. It's just changing the border color for first div, or it's just changing the border width for second div. Yes?
So instead of having all these divs, we should just have one div for the whole page and the front of the paragraph.
Well, depending on your design, it's pretty typical to have a bunch of different divs, just as far as like positioning different elements. So, for example, I'm trying to remember as far as the header of yours, but you have like those blocks, and each one of those could be its own div. Within any of those blocks, if you have a content to the left or content to the right, you might want to put each of those in their own separate div. Within like the menu itself, like yeah, it's possible. It just depends on your design. Again, paragraphs you should really just reserve to actual paragraphs. It shouldn't be just any old block of content. It should just be like when you're actually using paragraphs, like for the about or history sections. So yeah. So like I said, we can do the border with the 3 properties in there all together. We can also spell it out into width, color, and style. But usually we're doing the width, color, style if we already have a standard and we're just changing one thing. So right now, as it is, all of our divs are going to have a 5 pixel solid green border. But for first div, we're changing the color. And for second div, we're changing the actual width. Hang on. Oh, here it is. So yeah, for first div, we're changing the color here, so that's red now. And for the second div, it's a little hard to tell because these are bumping up right against each other. But this second div, let's make it more dramatic. 20 pixels. So for the second div, we have a much thicker border here, but the standard, the thing that we have for the third and fourth div that we see here, is just a 10 pixel border that's green. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Let's go back to just the second div having the border on there. So I'm going to take out what I did before and just simply have the border, 5 pixels, solid, and then green, which as everyone knows is 00FF00. No, not everyone knows that. But we have a 5 pixel green border around here. So this is going to make it a little bit easier to understand the box model that I was talking about before. Because now that we have a border, we can kind of see a little bit more what padding and margin actually mean. So padding is the stuff that is in between the border and the content. So I can put in a padding. So if I put in a padding of, let's say, 20 pixels, what that's going to do is it's going to add in 20 pixels of space between the content, which in this case is just a couple of sentences of text, between the content and the border itself. And when I put in padding and I say 20 pixels, again, that's going to do 20 pixels on all 4 sides. If I say margin, 20 pixels, The margin is in between the border and everything else around it. So the margin is outside of the border, and it determines the space between that actual block as well from everything else that would naturally be around it. So when I put in a margin of 20 pixels, that's putting in 20 pixels of space between this block itself, this div that has this green border, and everything else around it. Now, if I don't have the border in there, and I just put in padding, for example, then it looks like we have 20 pixels of space around this div. And again, if I don't have the border in there, and I just put in margin, it looks exactly the same. There's no difference between padding and margin. If I don't have a border in there, from the look of it, it looks exactly the same. But as soon as I have that border in there, then we can see that yes, the margin is just what's outside the border, and the padding is just what's inside the border. But you can kind of see the content itself looks like it kind of stays in the same place. So again, a lot of times padding and margin work pretty much the same way if you don't actually have a border or a background on that. But let's take a look at background for a minute.
So you wouldn't use them at the same time?
Oh no. There's a lot of cases where you would want to use them at the same time, especially if you actually are utilizing a border or a background for it. For example, with your design, you do have like these blocks, so there may be space outside those blocks, but there's also space kind of within those.
But it's taking the space from the edge of the rounder, but like I might want to do the edge of the rounder and then the edge of the block.
Exactly. Yeah, but it still also have a little bit of a space inside of that. So let's take a look at background while we're here. So the background, there is a background property, and unfortunately sometimes I see programmers just simply have a color in there. So you might have 0000FF for blue. So some people will add in a background color that way. This might work, but technically it's wrong, and I would stay away from things that are technically wrong because they're unreliable. The better way to set up a background color is actually doing background dash color. So if you do background dash color, then that will actually read the background color that you want in a much better way. Let's do something a little bit later. So we set this background color. This is kind of purple. So this is a kind of purple for this background color. Now, right now I have a border on it, I have a margin on it, I have a padding on it, and now I'm also adding in a background color. So the background is actually going to be in the same space as the padding itself. It's going to be between the border and the content, and actually also fill out that content. But the background color, background images, any sort of background properties are talking about what's actually inside that border. But again, I want to be very clear, the border isn't actually necessary. I don't want you to feel like you have to have borders on everything in your design. But if I don't have that border around it, and I just simply have the background, the padding is again everything that's in between that background, the edge of that background color, and the actual text. And the margin is everything that's between that background and the rest of everything else around it. So the background, again, works a lot like the border itself as far as the padding is on the inside and margin is actually on the outside.
If you want to change the font color for the site, would you do that?
Yeah.
And then just put it the font color?
So it's actually just going to be color. A lot of font properties do start off with font dash something, but for the actual text color or font color, it's just going to be color itself. So this we would put in 6Fs. No normal person should have hex values memorized. I just know some of them automatically. Again, you would typically pull, like, as far as those hex values from Photoshop or Illustrator as far as that color wheel. But like I said, a lot of I should say some text names will work relatively well as far as like white, black, red. It's just certain like specifics. Like if you say gray, for example, it's up to the browser to interpret what you mean by gray. Is that a light gray? Is that a dark gray? You know, so hex is typically a little bit more, yes, it's more accurate to exactly what you want.
What's the rule of thumb of just using color by itself instead of font dash color?
Oh, well, no. Sorry, I should have been more clear. Font dash color is not a real thing. It's you use font dash for some properties like font dash family, font dash size, font dash style is where you put in the italics, but font dash color is not actually a real thing. In order to change the text color or the font color, it's just simply color.
You want to make notes to yourself, like, because I just like imagine the CSS gets really, really long. Do you just write outside of that?
So in order to make notes or what's often called comments, you can use this syntax where you start off with a forward slash and an asterisk. And you can see that automatically brackets is kind of telling me by graying all of this out that this is a part of a comment. So we start off with a forward slash and an asterisk, and then we end with an asterisk and a forward slash. So it's just kind of a mirror of each other. And inside of here we can put in whatever sort of comment we want. So this is a good way of putting in some comments to just write notes to yourself as far as what these things are. For example, this is the second div. You can also put this in line with stuff. So this, you could put in a comment right next to this margin by saying slash asterisk. This is outside the border. And then again, we end it with an asterisk and a slash. Sure. You can also just write it out in the email too. But yeah, this would, I mean, feel free to use comments as much as you need to write notes to yourself as far as, you know, this is reminding yourself as far as what these things are. But yeah, you could also use that to communicate to me as well. Just in your email, just also specify this is something I'm looking for. The important thing is, again, you just want to make sure that you mirror it so they're not both slash asterisks. It starts with a slash asterisk and ends with an asterisk slash. So it's a mirror opposite. And if you forget that, again, brackets will let you know here by graying everything else out that comes after that. So right now, it's considering all of this a comment, which means the browser is going to ignore all this other stuff until we put in that asterisk slash. Yes, I definitely want to get into that. That is where we're going to be talking about floats and clears. Okay. Give me just a minute. I just want to get a little bit more into the talking about the margins and paddings in the background, and that's what we're going to be getting into next. With the padding and margin, typically, or very often, we have one value here. We have 20 pixels, and that is doing padding on all four sides, or margin on all four sides of this particular element. There's also a few different other ways that we can do the padding or the margin. We can say, instead of padding 20 pixels, and I'm just going to comment this first part out. So I'm going to say padding left 40 pixels. So this one adds padding on all four sides equally. This one is only going to add padding on just the left. So you can see that we have no padding here on the top, we have no padding here on the bottom, we have no real padding here on the left, or I'm sorry, on the right. It just has a little bit of the rag here. But we just have padding here on the left-hand side with the 40 pixels. So we have option of doing padding top, padding right, and padding bottom. And if we want, we can set them all to very different values from each other. So this is doing 40 on the left, 20 on the top, 50 on the right, and 100 on the bottom, if you want that. So you don't necessarily have to define all four. Obviously, you can only define the one that you really want if you want to only have one set of padding or one set of margin. So again, margin will work exactly the same way. Instead of just simply having one value in there, we can say margin left, margin right, margin top, and margin bottom. And that is doing 10 pixels of 10 pixels of margin on the left, 5 pixels of margin here on the right. It's kind of hard to tell. 50 pixels of margin here from the top, and 10 pixels of margin here from the bottom. So margin is whenever you have the border or the background color on it. Margin is what is outside of that border or that background background color. The padding is what's on the inside. Now, if you don't have a border and you don't have a background color, it's going to look identical as far as what you do with the padding or the margin. For the most part, it's going to be identical as far as padding and margin. But when you do, then again, margin's on the outside, padding's on the inside.
So if you get rid of the margin, then the purple will go to the edge.
Yep. So if we if we get rid of this margin as we have it here, then it's mostly going to be to the edge. Now, we do still have a little bit of on here on the sides, and that's because browsers by default assume that you want some margin or some padding on the whole page. So what we actually have to do is on the body, if we want things to be full bleed, then on the body we have to set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. On the body, if we set the margin and the padding to 0, then what that'll do is it'll make sure that things are absolutely flush. So as far as this background color itself, it's absolutely going to be flush to the sides, full bleed. It's also taking out any sort of extra margin or padding that we have for this very first div. So it's absolutely there in the top left corner.
And because that's first, like, because it's listed first, I was just thinking of like a situation where they might like influence and
Well, this one, so we're doing this on the body itself. In our HTML, the body houses everything in our HTML. We have everything that is visible is within the body, which is why when we put in a margin of 0 pixels and a padding of 0 pixels on the body itself, it makes sure that everything else that's inside of it is going to be flush. Now, it's going to be typical to have divs within divs, and you're going to be organizing kind of boxes for your design. And we're going to be talking through that, like how to actually make sure that it's as clear as possible. But for right now, we pretty much just have a very simple HTML structure. We have the body itself, and we have a series of divs as far as the next tier down. But again, it might be typical that you have like divs within divs, and you might have to do some sort of complicated structuring in order to make sure that like, it's going to be positioned exactly as you want it. But right now, we just simply have a body, and we have divs that are inside of that. So the margins and paddings, work pretty simply. So the body is talking about the everything, and the second div is talking about that div that's inside of it.
it gets really confusing with divs within divs. To avoid that, like we just use the P tag and
Well, you can. Again, I highly recommend only using the P tag when it comes to just real paragraphs that you just want a little bit of extra spacing in there. Again, when in doubt, I would always use a div, because you can always add in your own margin or padding. Whenever using the P tag, you're relying on the browser to add in margin or padding for you. You can always overwrite what the browser's doing, but by default, the P tag is going to have some padding or some margin to it. And I say some because Firefox might have a different idea as far as what that padding should be than Chrome, than Safari, than Internet Explorer. But paragraph tags always have a little bit of margin or padding automatically set to it.
most of the developers are fine with boxes. Like I'm just wondering if you're like working with a team and you have a ton of divs and you're passing it along. Are most developers fine with that?
Yeah, it's pretty standard to have a lot of different divs. The thing that's going to make it easy to pass on to other people is the actual names that you're using for your IDs and classes. So the names that you're using for your IDs and classes is going to make it as clear as possible when you're passing it to someone else. So yeah, I'm calling this first div, second div, third div. I would actually probably make this more towards whatever the content actually is. So this might be, for example, introductory paragraph. And the second one might be photos. Third one might be like footer, something like that. So that would make it a little bit clear to someone I'm passing it off to as far as the IDs or classes that I'm using. And again, feel free to make those IDs and classes multiple words, whatever makes it most clear as possible, just as long as you don't have any spaces or special characters in there. Any other questions or anything else we've gone over so far? Okay. Oh, one last thing as far as the margin and the padding. We can also put it all within one line. So we can say padding. If we put in just one value here, we have 20 pixels, and that means it's going to be 20 pixels on all four sides. We can put in two values, like 20 pixels and 100 pixels. Let's comment this out. So I put in 20 pixels at space 100 pixels. What that's going to do is it's going to do the first value is going to do the top and bottom. The second one is going to do the left and right. So this is going to be 20 pixels on top and bottom, 100 pixels on the left and right. If we do 4 values, then it goes in this order. The first one is going to be the top. The second one is going to be the right. The third one is going to be the bottom. And the fourth one is going to be the left. So it goes top, right, bottom, left. Now that might seem really arbitrary order, but the best way to think about it, and I think this is the way the original programmers thought about it, is that it's a clock. So it just, if you go clockwise, it starts at top, or it goes top, right, bottom, left in a clockwise order. I didn't make the internet, but this is the way that I probably would have done top left and bottom right, but yeah. But anyway, this is, again, we can have all 4 values in there, or you can have just 2 values, or you can just have 1 if you're just doing padding. Again, there's a lot of just personal preference here. There might be some reasons why it's very, very logical to do one over the other, but a lot of what you're seeing between these different ways of doing the padding, and again, margin works exactly the same way, is very much about personal preference. A lot of times I'm using 2 different values here because it's pretty rare that I want something only on the left or the right, or only on the top or the bottom when it comes to padding. When it comes to padding, a lot of times I'm just using 2 different values because it just simply makes sense to have the same amount of padding above and below, and the same amount of padding on the left and right. For margins, very often I'm using this kind of method where I'm spelling it out, because for margins, sometimes I want something only on the top or only on the left, as far as how it's actually positioning that thing from the rest of the content. But again, you'll find your own personal preferences and situations which makes the most sense to what it is you're trying to accomplish. So, backgrounds. Let's pull up. Yeah, I guess that's fine. So, so far we've only talked about the background color. If we want to set up a background image, then there's a few different properties that work for that. So first, let's go ahead. Go back to this margin here. That's fine. So we have a background color here. If we want to add in a background image, we start off by using the property background-image. And the value for this is also a little bit unique. The value for this, we want to put in URL and a set of parentheses and a semicolon. So we still have the value, we still have a semicolon at the very end of the line, but we have this URL, we have a set of parentheses here. Inside of those parentheses, we also want to put in a series of quotes. This can be single quotes or it can be double quotes. It doesn't really matter as long as you match it, so as long as you're using the same thing. But within those quotes, we want to say the path to the image that we're actually dealing with. So this works exactly the same way as the path for an anchor tag or an image tag. So when we do an anchor tag, we put in the folder we want. If we have multiple folders, same thing for the image tags, the src attribute for that. We can use / if we need to go up a folder. But from the CSS file, again, we always start with the file that we're actually dealing with. So from the CSS file, I'm going to go inside the images folder. I'm going to go inside the large folder. And I'm going to find photo1, let's do photo2.jpg. So we have URL, we have a set of parentheses, we have a set of quotes. From the CSS file, we're going to go into images. And brackets helps us out here, but it's good to actually know what we're actually doing. we do the folder images, and then we do the folder large, and then we actually find the file itself that we want. In this case is photo2.jpg. So, we have a background image and we have this particular photo. Let's take a look. We don't need to do the // We only need to do that if we need to go above one folder. So if, for example, this was, if this CSS was inside of a folder called CSS, if we had this inside of a folder called CSS, then from here, yes, we would need to go up one folder and then go into the images folder. But if we just simply have the CSS file in the same directory as everything else, from here, we just need to go into images and we just need to find the files we want. I was actually just missing the 0 before the 2, I believe. Yeah. So if we have that 0 there, then, or at least for my file name, that's the reason why I'm working. So by default, it's going to take the image itself and it's going to try and fit it within the content of that particular div. Now right now I have my browser not at full width, but you can see that as I make the browser wider and as it's sort of conforming that content, it's cropping the image from the top and left point, and it's just trying to fill in as much as it can with that content. Yes, very good observation. So you can see that this image itself is actually repeating. So it stops here because this is as wide as the image actually is, and this is simply going to repeat. The reason why it's doing this is naturally, and do I have a thumbnail? How big is this? Well, you can just take my word for it. So naturally, if we have like a pattern, for example, we have some sort of text that we want to just be a pattern, the background image assumes that you want to repeat the image over and over again. So let's actually set this instead of the second div. I'm going to cut and paste this so that it's going to be on the body instead of the second div. So you can see that this is repeating this both horizontally and vertically. And as I zoom out in the browser, you can see that it's actually doing that. Without any extra properties, when we just simply use background image, it's going to repeat it both horizontally and vertically, and it's going to use the image at the size of the image itself. So it's not going to try and stretch the image, it's not going to make the image any bigger or smaller than what it actually is naturally. It's just going to use that image actually as it is and repeat it horizontally and vertically.
Based on what you have set for month.
Well, based on these, so right now the browser is this size. As I make the browser window smaller, I can, kind of set it within just the actual size of the image. This is the actual size of the image, but it depends on the size of the container as well as the size of the actual browser. So, like I said, if we had it inside the second div, it's just putting the background image for that one container, but it's still repeating it within that area. Now, let's go back and put this back inside the body for a second. So we actually have several background properties related to image. When we just do background color, it's just kind of set it and forget it. We don't really have to do too much complicated with that. But when it comes to background image, there might be other things that we want to set up. For example, if we don't want it to repeat an image, then we're going to put in background dash repeat. And we have a few different options for background repeat. We can say repeat X. Repeat X means it's only going to repeat it along the X axis, in other words, horizontally. So it's only going to repeat it horizontally. We can do repeat Y, which means it's only going to repeat it along the Y axis, or it's only going to repeat it vertically. Just simply the word repeat, you don't have to really do that because it's going to do it for both. But typically we use background repeat when we're trying to do no dash repeat. Again, if I was making the internet, I would probably have it the same way, like repeat no or repeat 0 or something like that, but yeah, I didn't make the internet. So we do no repeat if we don't want it to repeat at all. We just simply want one version of that image. But you also have the option of repeat X or repeat Y. Sometimes you want a pattern that only goes vertically or only goes horizontally, which is why we have that option. So, yes.
Like, I guess you could get away with not putting the photo in your HTML, in your CSS. Like, you shouldn't do that, but I guess you could.
Well, it really just depends on what it is you're trying to do. So, for example, if I want to use the image as a background, in other words, I want stuff actually on top of that image itself, which doesn't necessarily have to necessarily be a photo. It could be some sort of texture. It could be some sort of it could be a texture. It could be some sort of background element, just like space, for example, itself. This is, if we take a look at our original index, which is actually still using our CSS, this is an actual image itself. We want to see this image by itself. We don't want anything on top of it. This is a good case to use an actual image tag. If we...
There's no, like, image, like, in CSS. Like, there's a background image or not.
Well, you can reference your images in CSS, which you would typically do if you're trying to add borders to your images or adjust the size of your images within CSS.
But it always has to, like, be in the HTML. I just thought that was interesting that you can, like, put the URL in the image in CSS, but you can also, like, put it here.
Yeah. So the thing is, again, a lot of it has to do with what it is that makes the most sense to you as far as like actually accomplishing the design. But I would say typically you would use an image tag inside of your HTML if you don't want anything on top of the image. You just want to kind of treat the image and you want to see the image fully as it is. You use a background if you actually want content on top of it. You don't really care as much about like how it's necessarily cropping it, or we don't actually need to see the full thing. So for example, this I would say is not a really great example of a background image, because if I have stuff on top of their faces, again, if this was like a fan site or something like that, you know, people are going to say like, well, why do you have like stuff on top of these people? A space background would make a lot more sense as a background image, because we don't really care about what's actually on top of that. So we use an image tag if we want that image to be very visible kind of by itself without anything on top of it. We use a background image, and we do the background image inside of our CSS. We use a background image if we're okay with stuff on top of that, because we just wanted to kind of fill in that area as a background texture or something to kind of add to the content. Does that make sense? So,
Where the background
you're talking about in the CSS, or? So yeah, with background images, we have the, again, with background color, we just simply have background dash color. With background images, we have a few different properties to think about. Background image is where we actually set the URL for that image itself. Background dash repeat is where we can set it so that it is repeating the way that we want it to. By default, it's going to do horizontal and vertical, but we can say no repeat if we don't want it to repeat at all. We also have background dash position. So by default, a background image is going to be in the top left and repeat from there. With background position, we have a few different ways of setting this up. But typically, with background position, we use two different words. The first word is going to involve the vertical positioning, so we can say top. And the second one is going to reference the horizontal positioning, so we can say left, for example. And this will be top left. Now, obviously, we wouldn't do this because that's the default anyway, but we could say top right. So it'll be from the top right. We can also say center. This is not enough content. So typically, this actually is doing centered, but it's doing centered based on the content that we have. If this was a lot more content, just for an illustration, I'm going to add in a few more divs here. Okay. So this is centering it based on the actual content that we actually have, but it's centering it on the right. So we can put in top, center, or bottom for the first value. And that will determine whether it's toward the top, center, or the bottom of our content. And we can put in left for the second value. We can put in left, center, or right for the second value. So by using those words, it's just automatically going to put it in that space as far as the top, left, bottom, or right, or center for either one. We can also put in specific pixels. So if we put in 50 pixels space 200 pixels, what it's going to do is the first value is going to be for the, oddly enough, first value is going to actually be the horizontal, so it kind of switches. The first value is going to be the horizontal, how much space it is from the left-hand side. So this is 50 pixels from the left. And the second one is going to be for the vertical, so this is 200 pixels from the top. And despite how we scroll, despite how we resize the browser, it's going to be exactly at that 50 pixels and 200 pixels.
Can you send the second value in vertical?
Yeah, when we're not using the words, it actually switches. So it's going to use the 200 pixels from as far as the vertical, and the first one is going to be the horizontal. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why it does that, but that's kind of just the way it's set up. So if we are not repeating, then it's going to utilize the background position in whatever way that we set it up. But you'll notice that even if we are repeating, it actually will kind of still use that general positioning. So right now we have it at 50 pixels, 200 pixels, which means that it's going to start a full version of that photo there, and then repeat outwards both left, right, bottom, and top from that point. If we did not have the background position in there, it's going to repeat from that top left corner, but when we do have the background position in there, it's going to repeat from that at that point. There are times when I've actually purposely done it this way, when you want a pattern, but it doesn't really work from the top left. But obviously you have a lot of different options there. The last one that we have as far as a background, which is very useful, is background size. So with background size, there's a few different ways that we can actually use this, but the most common is with the words contain or cover. I'm going to take the position out for a sec, or actually, let's do top center for the background position. Okay. So for the, naturally that's going to put it just in the top and center of the page. And again, as we resize the browser itself, it's going to stay centered at the top and center. Now, for background size, again, very typically we're using this with either contain or cover. If we use contain, what it's going to do is it's going to stretch the image as much as it can, but it's not going to make the image any bigger than it needs to. I'm sorry, it's not going to make the image any bigger than it needs to in order to actually contain it within that area. So, as I resize the browser itself, it's going to be 100% of the width. But it's not going to crop the image at all. Contain means that I don't want to crop the image. I want to see the full image itself. Let's take a look at this if we have it inside the second div. So whereas when we had it in the body, it kept stretching the image and to the full width. With the second div we have a lot less height to work with. So it's going to make it 100% of the height, and it's just going to fill in the rest with the background color. But again, contain means I want to see the full image. I want to see all four sides of the image. I want to see all four corners of the image. And I don't want you to crop it at all. Cover means I'm telling the browser it's perfectly fine for you to crop the image, but what I don't want to see is any other background. So where we have this background color here and we have cover, again, it's going to try to use 100% of the area that we have there, but we're definitely not seeing the background color there. It's going to cover as much as it can for this this space that we have here. But it naturally means that it's going to crop it. So when you use cover, it's almost always going to be cropping that image. So you have to decide how to control that crop. So right now we're using a background position of top and center as it crops it. If we use a background position of center, then it's still going to crop it, but it's going to crop it from the center of that image. But when we use background size cover, again, it's going to always crop that image. Let's take a look at this in the body. Well, a logo, I would probably use an actual image tag because we don't want anything.
We wouldn't use background.
For the logo, we typically don't want anything on top of the logo. So we use background whenever we are fine with having content actually on top of it. Yes, there might be times when we actually want to see a full image. Where we use a background contain, yes, a lot of times again if we want to see the image and we don't want anything else to be on top of it, we're using an actual image tag within our HTML where we use a background image itself if we actually are positioning some sort of content on top of that. Yeah.
So this would be good for that, like, golden.
Oh yeah, so we're where Sohan had as far as the header, the about on top of the cheesecake. Yeah, we would use a background image for that section, and then we would actually have the about to be somewhere within that. So within the HTML, it might be something like this is just an example, but within the HTML, you might decide to have div ID header image, something like that, and within that header image, maybe he has an H1 or H2 tag that says about, and this would be basically everything that would be in the HTML. But then within the CSS, then that's where we would have a div with the ID header image, and then this is where we would have that background image, and then it would go to wherever that actual image is. Yeah, exactly. Utilizing the background position and size and things like that, that's how you can decide how you like that cropped. So this is how it looks if we have that background image within second div. Let's take a look at it within the body for a minute. So here we're using background position, we're using center, we're using no repeat, we're using background size cover. So here it is trying to make sure that it's utilizing for all the content of the page. So again, this might be more or less depending on how many paragraphs we have here, but all these paragraphs means that the body itself is going to be this height, and it's going to kind of use as much of the space as possible, which means that it's using 100% of the height, and it's going to be cropping it on the left and right, as well as the top and bottom, as it needs to, in order to make sure that it's as visible as possible. Now, one last background property. So I'm going to take background size off for a minute. So we're just using top and center, and just using the background image as it is, or the size that it is. Last background property is background dash attachment. It's kind of an odd one, and we typically use this with fixed. So background attachment fixed means that as we scroll, the background itself is staying in the same place. So when we don't have background attachment and fixed, then that means that when we scroll, it's going to scroll along with everything else. When we have the background attachment fixed, that means that as we scroll, it's going to stay in the same place. So it's kind of assuming that we want to have everything else scroll on top of that. Now, when we use that in conjunction with background dash size, and we use the cover, you see that it's again trying to cover as much as it can. Cover means that we're okay with it cropping. We don't want to see any other background color. But it actually scrolls all the text that's on top of that. So this would be an example of if we want to have some sort of background that we don't want it to stretch through the whole height of the content itself, all these different paragraphs, considering all these different paragraphs of content. We don't want to stretch that sort of height, but we do want to stretch for the height of the entire visible screen. And the same thing with contain. Contain again means we don't want to crop the image at all. It's perfectly fine if it fills in the left and right or the top and bottom with whatever sort of background color that we have. But it's just stretching it to the size of the browser and not the size of the content. Does that make sense as far as the difference between the size of the browser and the size of the content? Right now we have a bunch of different paragraphs in here, which is why it's sometimes a bit higher than it needs to be.
If you want to make, like I'm just thinking what else fix to go with, if you want to make an navigation fix, what would the property be? Like, do you want to take a whole area?
So, yeah, a lot of times you want to have, and this comes up a lot with navigation, is we have a navigation that we want to stay in the exact same place no matter how we scroll. That is when we're actually going to get into the position property, which I'd still like to get to today, but there's one thing I want to go over before we get to that part. I'd like to get into the floats and clears before we actually get into that. But any other questions regarding the backgrounds or borders, anything like that first? Okay. So, this is going to be hard to look at all this time. Let's go and comment this out. And with our HTML, let's go ahead and take out all those other divs. Okay. So, back to a much simpler design here. Again, we have just the 4 different paragraphs that are just coming right after each other. Again, on the class website, I have a link for where it says float and clear. And this is, again, it's a good article to read to kind of get into a lot of detail about using the floats and clears, which I would highly recommend. But basically, we use floats and clears as one way that we can position content right next to each other. So this mostly has to do with horizontal positioning. Obviously with vertical positioning, it mostly has to deal with, as far as vertical ordering, I should say. The vertical order mostly has to do with the vertical order that you actually have in your HTML. If you want to switch the vertical order of first div and second div, I would just recommend just doing that within your HTML. But when it comes to horizontal positioning, so we might want the second paragraph right next to the third paragraph horizontally, then a float is one way of actually doing that. So just so that we can see what it is that we're actually working with, let's look at the third div and let's go ahead and let's put this up a little bit. So for the third div, let's also give it a background color. Let's make it some kind of red. Let's also make the text color white so it's a little easier to see. Sure. You know what, we'll give it the same padding, the same margin as we do for the second div. Just for now. The only difference is the background color at this point. So, right now, we have 2 different divs with special properties on them. The second div has this purple background. It has 20 pixels at the top and bottom, and 100 pixels on the left and right. And we have the third div, which has a 20 pixel top and bottom, 100 pixels on the left and right, and again a margin of 20 pixels on the outside. Now, this is one area where margin is a little bit unique from padding. Like I said, it's they're pretty much the same when you're not using a background or a border, but this is one area where it can be a little bit different. Right now, we have 20 pixels of margin on all four sides of the second div and the third div, which means that we have 20 pixels here at the top, 20 pixels here at the left, 20 pixels here at the right, and 20 pixels here at the bottom. But you'll notice that what we have between these two paragraphs is not doubled up. So you might expect 20 pixels, if this is 20 pixels here, you might expect twice that height between these two paragraphs. Margin actually overlaps when it comes to the elements around each other. So when I have 20 pixels on the bottom for the purple paragraph and 20 pixels on the top for the red paragraph, the browser just assumes that you want them 20 pixels apart. Whereas yeah, so we have where we have top and bottom here. This again kind of just overlaps that margin and assumes you just simply want 20 pixels apart from each one. Yeah. So if we have 40 pixels for the second div, we see 40 pixels here at the top, and it's the exact same here at the bottom. So yes, it is. It just basically takes whatever the bigger one is and uses that as the separation between the two. But yeah. So when it comes to actually trying to position these right next to each other, the main property that we want to do is what's called float. So with float, we have a few different options here, but typically with float we are either using a left or a right. Now, as soon as we float elements, like so we're going to do the float left on the second div. As soon as we float an element, it's going to take it out of the natural flow of the page. So the natural flow of this page, when we have these four paragraphs, is naturally it's just going to flow. The natural flow is going to be a vertical stack. So these are just vertically stacking these four paragraphs one after the other. When we add in float left to the second div, I'm going to hit refresh. It's taking it out, excuse me, it's taking out of the natural flow of things, which means that, at least in this case, it's kind of overlapping this area that should be for the third div. Now, if we don't have borders or backgrounds on this, it might not look that odd. As soon as we put the float on the second paragraph, we would just see some extra space here. But it's important to remember again, when we do the float, it is taking things out of the natural flow of the rest of the containers. So again, right now the goal is we want the purple paragraph or the second paragraph, second div, next to the third one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do float left on the second div, and I'm going to do float right on the third div. Now again, as soon as we're doing floats, we're taking things out of the natural flow of stacking them vertically. So I have float left on the second, float right on the third, and when I hit refresh, it's actually stacking them again. So we have the second paragraph on the top and the third paragraph on the bottom. So the reason why they're not next to each other yet is by default, any sort of block level element, paragraphs, divs, whatever it is, any sort of block level element that's going to have a line break before and after is going to try and stretch to 100% of the width of the screen. Width 100% is the default setting for any block level element. So the browser would very much like to put these right next to each other because we have the floats on it. But we haven't told the browser what the size of these two things are. So we have to tell the browser how much space horizontally these two things are going to take up. So let's start with pixels. So with the second div, we can set up a width of, let's say, 200 pixels. And for the third div, let's set up a width of 400 pixels. Yes. So, as soon as we do that, what it's going to do is it's going to set up this purple paragraph, which is the second div. It's going to set this up to a smaller size than it was before. As far as naturally, it was trying to be 100% of the screen, and now it's only going to be 200 pixels. So it has some space to the left and right of it. Same thing with the third paragraph, or the red paragraph. We have a width of 400 pixels on that, which means it's now going to not be 100% of the screen. It's only going to be start off at 400 pixels. Now, one thing that you want to know about these widths. The width is for the content itself. So we have a width of 200 pixels for the actual text that we're dealing with here. The padding and the margin go outside of that width. So this is 400 pixels, what I have highlighted here. And then we add in a padding of 100 on either side to complete the whole size of this thing. And then we actually have extra margin around that part of it. Same thing with this purple paragraph. This is 200 pixels. We add in 100 pixels on the left, 100 pixels on the right, as far as the width of this entire container, and then there's extra margin outside of that. So whenever we're dealing with the width here, the width actually has to deal with the content, and then padding and margins are all outside of that. Now you're actually living in a wonderful time right now. The fact that all browsers tend to actually agree on where that width and padding actually interact. There used to be a time when every single browser had a different idea of like when it's like, no, I think the padding should be included in the width. Like, no, I think the padding should be outside of the width. It was a thing called the browser wars, which is a lot less cool than it sounds. But basically, right now, browsers tend to agree as far as like what that width actually means, except for very, very old browsers. You might see on the older versions of Internet Explorer, for example, that it might be still considered to be kind of inside. The width is inside the padding. But yeah. Anyway. So we have a width and a height set up to this, and we have it set up in this way so that it is not going to be 100% of the screen. So when we're using the floats, it's naturally going to put these right next to each other. Now you'll notice that this fourth paragraph is kind of trying to wrap around the rest of this. One way to think of floats is in the same way that when you're reading a newspaper, when you have like an image kind of inset to that paragraph, the text kind of wraps around the rest of that image. That is kind of the natural state of a lot of floats. Let's go ahead and okay, so for right now, I'm just going to take off these extra properties we have for third div. When we just have second div set up with the float, and we have a specific width to it, the third div, the one that starts with this present? Yeah. The third div, again, is trying to wrap around this that we are setting up to be a float on the left. If we had the second div float right, then it's going to put this paragraph itself, or this div, on the right, and it's going to float everything else around it. So, with the floats, you're using the floats in conjunction with width. Again, float doesn't really mean anything until you actually have a width in there. But you're using floats in conjunction with the width in order to actually position things horizontally. Now there's other ways of positioning things horizontally, and we're gonna have to get into that next week. That's mostly using the position tag itself. But this is one way of doing it with the float left and the float right. Now, you might see something like this. You might say, it's like, that's great, but I really want this fourth paragraph to be on a line all by itself. There's two ways of accomplishing that to make sure that this this fourth paragraph is on a line. I'm sorry, there's like 5 different ways of accomplishing that. But the most common way of doing that, so that this fourth paragraph is kind of just on its own, it's not trying to float around everything else. Well, I'll go over the two most common. One way of doing it is we can have a div that's in between our last floated thing, which is the third div, and the fourth div. And I'm going to give this a class. I'm going to call it clear div. So one way of doing this is we have a div in between the last floated thing that we have, which is the third div, and the thing that we don't want floated, the fourth div. And it's going to be div by itself. And what we're going to do is inside of our CSS, we're going to reference this div. And we're going to use the property clear, and we're going to say both. Clear has the option of doing clear left and clear right, but typically we're using it in this case with both. Clear both basically means that we want to clear out any sort of floats on both the left and the right, so that this div that's kind of a placeholder div in between the two would just clear everything out. This is one way of setting it up so that these two floats are by themselves. It's not taking anything extra. Another way to do this is I'm going to go ahead and take this clear div out. And I'm going to wrap a div around both second and third. So I'm going to say div ID middle. So I'm going to start that middle section div before second div. I'm going to tab both second div and third div over. And I'm going to end middle section right after third div. So now we have these two divs, second div and third div. We have them inside of a div called middle section. In our CSS, I'm going to say div hash middle section. And I'm going to say overflow and auto. This does pretty much the exact same thing as the other one, where it's going to make sure that this div that we have as middle section will kind of be on its own. Now we can actually give this, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Be lazy and use a color name. This middle section, if we use a background color of yellow, you can kind of see what space it's taking up. The middle section is, we have an overflow auto on that, and that just simply means that it's going to be on its own, and anything that comes before it, anything that comes after it, is on a line all by itself, so it's not floating the stuff around it. So yeah. Both of these techniques work. Again, one way of doing it is you have the div in between the floated element and the non-floated element, and you use the property clear, both on that. The other way of doing it, and I think this is probably a little bit more common, is you wrap the things that you're floating inside of its own div. So you wrap the things you're floating inside of its own div. For example, we have this middle section. And then for that middle section, we're using overflow auto. and that's the property. I can get into a little bit more as far as why we use this and why we use that in another time, but that is another way you can kind of make sure this is set all on its own. So, sorry, just real quick, just before people head out, I would highly recommend kind of reading through some of those articles, especially the one about the float and clear. This is going to get into a lot more detail about how the float and clear work and different sort of kind of typical layouts that you would typically do. But we're going to talk a little bit more about it next week as well, along with the position property, which if you want to get a little bit ahead and you want to kind of take a look at how some of the positioning things work with that, you can take a look at that as well. But yeah, again, this is one way of us starting to set up the layouts, so we can no, it's okay. That's mostly what I want to go over today. When you start to plan out creating your HTML page, just think about things in boxes. Think about things in sections of rectangles, and think about like how you want to separate that out into your HTML. So separate out into your HTML first. Kind of create like the divs and the paragraph tags and whatever sort of sections you want for that first. And give things IDs, give things classes as it makes the most sense for that content. Try to put in as much style as you can. I've pretty much gone over only, we'll say the float and clear is just kind of one way of doing positioning. So next week we're going to be getting into the position tag, which is going to open up a few other different resources as far as doing positioning. Sometimes you're using, well, usually you're using combinations of different positioning methods. Like you might be using position absolute for like the navigation, and you're using floats and clears for the actual paragraphs and images for the tags. So we're going to be talking about all the different tools that we have available to us, and hopefully next week I'm actually going to walk through actually using these tools from a real design. So I'm going to have a design, but we're going to actually kind of pick it apart so you can actually see the process that I would go through for that. But get as much done as you can on your about page. Think about like the styles that you want, think about like the colors and things like that you want to actually include in there. But we definitely will be going over other positioning methods and making sure that that's as clear as possible. Cool. Alright, that is everything for today.